Hi everyone, welcome to week 1 of Lit 215. I'm going to hopefully make this a short, fingers crossed, video about the introduction to multicultural American literature, particularly the contemporary period, which is where we are working this semester, and then a little introduction to The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, which is our first novel. Yay! Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. The assignments you've got for this week are pretty, I hope, self-explanatory. You have a reading quiz that'll be due Thursday, and that is based on the readings for week 1, which you'll find under the week 1 folder in our course content section on Blackboard. So that includes pages, I believe, 1 through 83 of The Lone Ranger and Tonto. A very short PDF on contemporary American literature, and then a quick video on multicultural literature in particular. The reading quiz is pretty short and sweet. It's 15 questions each week, and it's going to cover bits and pieces of each of those readings. So I do recommend that you all take notes while you read. If you have and own the copy of your novel, I am one of those monsters that writes in... Here, if I can make it. There we go. I am one of those monsters that writes in my books because I find that while I write, if I write while I read, I tend to retain more and think a little more deeply. So if you can't highlight or write in your book, I suggest getting a notebook and taking notes as you go. I promise it will help you retain and make connections between the information that you're getting. And then you have a discussion board due Thursday. Please make sure they respond to 2 classmates in our discussion by Sunday. I will also be participating in the discussion, and hopefully I see a lot of good convo between you all and about not just the Lone Ranger and Tonto, but also Native American literature, and all of that good stuff. So in this course, we are focusing on the contemporary period of American literature, which is 1945 to present, which that is a huge time period. Not only that, contemporary American literature, particularly multicultural, covers a huge variety of experiences and ethnicities and cultures, and just huge. You know, you could spend your entire life studying just one author in this period. So I wanted to kind of give you guys the idea of really how much is just pushed into this period. From the reading on Blackboard, the PDF on the contemporary period, you'll notice they talk about some significant cultural events and historical events that really impact the literature of this contemporary time period. So World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War and other conflicts, the information age, also economic recessions like what we have felt in 2008 and are experiencing now, 9/11, Katrina, and other natural disasters. You know, when you look at this list, though, I mean, this is what, 7 bullet points to cover 75 years of history. What others would you add? What's something that maybe was significant to your culture, or your family, or your city or neighborhood that should make this list? And it's really important when you think about American literature because we have such a variety of sort of social experiences that are being described in literature that the historical context within which these stories are situated is of paramount importance. And we'll see this in The Lone Ranger and Tonto, and we'll see this really in all of the novels we read this semester. So some key features of contemporary literature is the focus from what we call modern literature to postmodern. So modern literature was popular in the US up until about the 1950s. So imagine modern literature as this sort of like idyllic American dream type stories. And then postmodern is really where we start to experience a lot more change, uncertainty, worry, fear, but also diversity, you know? So other aspects, humor as a coping mechanism, which actually Sherman Alexie in Tonto uses quite well, in my opinion, a continued sort of space for minority writers, a increased focus on race and ethnicity, and most importantly, an understanding of colonial influence and global power structures. So I think, you know, if you have heard terms like decolonizing literature, the working under the patriarchy, colonized groups. These are all in reference to the idea that America was influenced and really built on colonialism, and that the impact of colonialism and colonizers is still alive and well in how we experience our world. So this is not an acknowledgement of that, I don't know, white people are bad, for example, or that we want to kind of rehash this complicated history. It's not about rehashing, it's about recognizing. It's about knowing the privilege that white people often experience in our society and why that is. So this is something that we see discussed in each of the novels we're going to talk about, and something that you just want to be aware of, that particularly for multicultural literature, it's very important that we remember that America was built on essentially the backs of colonized people. So these are really important key features. Then let's move on to some questions to ask yourself. As you read our different novels this semester, I want you to think about how these experiences differ or align with your own. Is there anything that you see in Sherman Alexie's stories, for example, that really resonate with you or that are very new to you? And then what does it mean to be multicultural? This doesn't just have to do with race and ethnicity, but also gender and sexual orientation and socioeconomic status. This has to do with really just the multitude of experiences that we are a part of. And then what of those historical or cultural events might be influencing a story? If you don't know about the events surrounding a story, look them up, all right? If you encounter a reference or a word in the stories we read, you're like, I don't really know what that is, don't just skip past it, all right? Use Google. Use the resources available to you, and you'll have a much better understanding of these stories. So let's skip ahead to Native American literature in particular. So our first text is, like I said, by the author Sherman Alexie. He's one of the most famous Native American authors for contemporary American literature, but not the only one. So what's important for Native American literature to recognize is that this is the literature of indigenous peoples to the Americas. So Native American literature does also include those of Native peoples from, say, Central America and South America, although there is really some overlap with Latin American and Hispanic American literature. So what we're talking about is indigenous peoples to the Americas. And this is not one set of literature. It's not one collection, one piece, but it's the idea that there are hundreds of tribes that make up the Native American tradition, and that each of their literatures is distinct, each of their languages is distinct, and each of their cultural experiences is distinct. So Native American literature started orally. There were a lot of emphasis on folktales and myths and storytellers in sort of ancient Native American history. And that we see reflected even in Sherman Alexie's text with the character Thomas. So you'll notice some common themes are the importance of nature and the natural world, ethical and moral codes, and the political struggle of Native Americans asserting their place in American society under the strain and the weight of intense government persecution and oppression. So there was also something in Native American literature tradition called the Native American Renaissance. And this was an increase in stories told by Native American authors in mainstream literature. And this kind of started in the 60s and is still, in all honesty, continuing today. We probably saw the biggest boom in the 80s and 90s, which is why this first book we're reading is from 1993. So The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven is one of Sherman Alexie's collections of short stories. So this is a set of interconnected stories. You'll notice that Victor is the narrator of most of these stories, and they're particularly about life on the reservation he's from. He's from the Spokane Indian tribe in Spokane, Washington, and the sort of the struggles that they experience, the traditions that they come from, and then also this sort of will to survive. So you'll notice that poetry, narrative, and storytelling is really interwoven into Alexi's writing, and that can get kind of confusing sometimes. So you might have to take a step back and reread and, look some stuff up if you're getting confused, because Alexi has this way of really just sort of inviting us into the world of Native American experience and then sort of letting us find our way. All right, so if you get confused, you're not the only one. This text is based on what Alexi called reservation realism, and I think I actually have. So in the introduction, Alexi confesses the largely autobiographical nature of these stories, but he also asserts that they're really not true. They are the vision of one individual looking at the lives of his family and his entire tribe, so these stories are necessarily biased, incomplete, exaggerated, diluted, and often just plain wrong. But in trying to make them true and real, I am writing what might be called reservation realism. So when you're reading these stories, I think there is a blurred line between what's actually true and what is implied. And I think that's what makes these experiences both so complex and so compelling. So some historical references you might encounter in our first section of the text are in the title. If you're not aware, the Lone Ranger was a popular American Western character in TV during like I want to say the 70s. I should look that up. And then Tonto was his Native American companion. He was like a guide. And I think it's interesting that Alexi chose this as the title to his book. And I want to know if you guys want to discuss this in our discussion board or kind of just think about it. Why would he do that? What significance does that have? Who does Tonto represent to Alexi, and who does the Lone Ranger represent? Additionally, you'll notice references to both Crazy Horse and Custer, or Custer's Last Stand. So Crazy Horse was probably one of the most famous Native American warriors. He was a Lakota war leader, and he fought against the U.S. encroachment of Native territory in the northwest United States. And then Custer's Last Stand was a famous battle between Native tribes, led actually by Crazy Horse and other war leaders and U.S. forces. And this event was a large victory for Native tribes against the U.S. government, and I think is sort of viewed as actually, before I tell you how I think it should be viewed, I'll just ask you to kind of think about these. So if you're not really sure about other references you come across, look them up. Like I said, they'll really help you have a better understanding of the text. And then finally, once you've kind of got through these first week's readings, I want you to kind of look at the literary project description under week 1 in Blackboard, because we're going to have a project that sort of transcends all of what we're talking about in the course. And your first assignment for it, the culture paper, is going to be due next week. So thank you guys for making it this far. I am really excited to kind of get your thoughts on, our text and Native American literature. And I will see you next week.